Welcome back. This is Geography 10. What are we up to? Lecture 15? I did not prepare any new slides for today. We're going to finish up the last lecture, and then we are going to do some things in connection with the readings for today and for last Thursday. We're going to talk about Orwell, and we're going to talk about Delany. Has everybody had a chance to read the Orwell and the Delany? No. How many of you have read the Orwell? Oh, good. Okay, because that's going to be the piece we need more today. The schedule for next week has changed slightly. Because of the way my panels got scheduled at a conference next week, I can't be here Tuesday. I knew I was going to be gone on Thursday, but it turns out I'll be gone on Tuesday as well. So instead of a lecture on Tuesday and a movie on Thursday, next week we will have a movie on Tuesday and another movie on Thursday. So we are moving one of the movies from the end of the semester up to next Thursday. So on Tuesday, we will watch Life and Debt, which is about Jamaica. And on Thursday, we will watch Maculopolis, which is about a city on the border between the U.S. and Mexico and the struggles there over environmental quality and working conditions in the Maquilas. All right? So where were we last time? I did not quite finish last lecture. I got to this point. I'm going to pick it up from the beginning of the discussion of uneven development. There's a definition here from Neil Smith's entry in the Dictionary of Human Geography, 4th edition. Uneven development, a systematic process of economic and social development that is uneven in space and time and endemic to capitalism. Does everybody know what endemic means? What does endemic mean? Anybody? Yeah. Inherently a part of it. That's a good way of putting it. When you talk about endemism of species, we mean that it's a species that is found only in a certain place, is native to that place, is sort of uniquely connected with that place. In this case, the term is being used more broadly to indicate that this unevenness is an intrinsic feature of capitalism. It's inherently a part of capitalism. I said last time, I used this slide to illustrate this briefly, and of course this is just at the national scale. So just simply the size of the economies, the national economies of different countries of the world. And you'll see that China is among the richest countries in the world, but here this is not per capita. This is just in terms of the overall size of their economy. Apart from China, the rest of the countries here are ones that we would consider to be first world nations, right? Developed countries. Obviously, other parts of the world you see a wide range of economic development. Again, at the national scale, great deal of poverty in Africa, but also other countries in Asia and South America, Central America. Again, you have to sort of divide this by population to get a sense of how it affects people at an individual level. But this is one very simple and obvious example of uneven development. Hello? It's not working. There we go. I suggested that this is the case at multiple scales. The national scale is just one of them. You can think of it at the global scale in the contrast between the developed and the developing world, or the first world and the third world, the global north and the global south. That's at that scale, development is uneven. It's also uneven at the national scale. You look within the United States. And here we have to open this up. It's not just a question of dollars, prosperity per person. It's also just the differences across the landscape between urban and rural, between industrial areas and service areas or tourist areas. Different kinds of economic activity distributed spatially in ways that are highly uneven. And we're accustomed to this. We move through it all the time. You can also think of it at the urban scale. Right here in the Bay Area, there are dramatic examples of uneven development. And you can even think of it at smaller scales than that, in the individual interactions that anybody has on a given day. Yes? An example of one that's around here. We could take the contrast between Berkeley and Oakland. Right? Obviously, if you go south from here, you will move from university into a residential district. You can think about who lives there, the architecture, the size of the houses, the general atmosphere, the trees, whether it's pretty or less pretty. And you go across that line into Oakland, and it's not an abrupt change. But by the time you're 10 blocks into Oakland, you can tell that something's different. And obviously, that will depend on your individual perceptions, right? What you're accustomed to. You might grow more comfortable as you make your way in Oakland, or you might grow less comfortable, right? More familiar or less familiar. There are places, I mean, if you really want to push this, you could contrast, Rockridge or Piedmont with Richmond, right? And if you know the history of Richmond and the ways in which it boomed around World War II and then collapsed economically after World War II, and the legacy that's left across the landscape in terms of housing, in terms of social services, in terms of all the way to landscaping and the provision of parks, that is an example of extraordinary unevenness. Again, I think at the very personal level, you can actually, we feel this kind of stuff all the time. Your own history creates you as a person with certain kinds of skills, training, things that you're comfortable with, ways of speech, ways of dress, and you feel the contrast or the fit between yourself and the milieu you happen to be in at any given moment. We're all versatile within certain bounds, but we move through space and experience this unevenness on an ongoing basis. And the challenge here, and this is what I'm going to try to get us to think about in connection with Orwell and Delany, believe it or not, is to think about all those different scales of unevenness simultaneously and their interactions with each other and how they affect each other. So this idea of uneven development, in the first instance, thinking about it as endemic to capitalism, it's about economic activity, production, wealth versus poverty, jobs versus lack of jobs or informal employment. But it extends out from there, or it also encompasses things that might not look like economic activity on the face of it. They're cultural aspects of it, political, religious, linguistic. All of these factors and axes of difference are potentially of relevance to the kinds of things that we're trying to talk about here. Other questions? Anybody want to offer an example of the most extreme uneven development you happen to have encountered in your lifetime? A contrast that stands out for you, or that you remember for whatever reason. Any of you have a Orwell shooting an elephant type experience in your past that you'd like to share? Yeah. The border between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. I don't know that border. What's it like? Okay, $20 million 8-bedroom homes on one side of the creek and crappy little apartments that people can't afford on the other side. And who lives on the other side? Graduate students? No? Service employees? The workers? The people who mow the grass on campus? Okay, who lives in the $20 million homes? CEOs of high-tech companies? And why do you suppose they're right there across the creek from each other? Okay. The university has probably had a profound effect on the development of the surrounding community and the real estate and zoning and building practices and who lives where. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so there's a county aspect to this as well. The wealth or the prosperity of one county versus another can affect the kinds of things that they can provide to the people who live there. Other thoughts on that? Not really. Anyone have an uneven development experience this morning, by any chance? No. Okay. So the question becomes, why is this development uneven? And last time I got partway through a series of potential answers to this. In the first instance, you might think, well, there's a natural unevenness in the world. The distribution of natural resources and kinds of soil and supplies of water and sort of landforms that lend themselves to navigation or ports or roads, where it makes sense to put a railroad. All these things could have some kind of effect. They could shape the development that unfolds on that landscape, and because the landscape is uneven, the development might be uneven. And this has a certain logical intuitiveness to it, right? I mean, why do we grow corn in the Midwest? Well, it has at least something to do with the fact that there is, or was, 6 or 7 feet of really high-quality topsoil and a climate very well suited to growing corn. To that extent, it might make sense to think of unevenness as related to nature, and therefore natural. And this would be a sort of environmental determinist argument if you carried it far enough, right? If you said that is all you need to know to understand why development is uneven. Now, if you actually start looking at the history of the Midwest and corn, it quickly becomes apparent that that's not an adequate explanation. It might be part of an adequate explanation, but it is not complete. We wouldn't grow corn in the Midwest the way we do in the absence of markets to get that corn to, ways of moving that corn from where it's grown to where it's used and consumed. And that, in turn, has a lot to do with, for instance, Chicago, and the relationship of Chicago in the 19th century to New York, and the building of railroads and canals, and the ways in which money from New York could move to Chicago, and from Chicago outward across the plains to provide credit to farmers who were trying to start farms, and gave them an obvious market opportunity growing corn rather than something else, growing corn for market to ship to Chicago rather than, say, vegetables to ship to Des Moines, right? If you look, I showed this one last time. If you just look at energy, it's obvious that the energy is not being consumed in the same places that it was left by nature, so to speak. It moves, and in moving, it feeds into uneven development across a whole range of spheres, right? Our ability to consume oil here, at the outset, we had oil of our own, and we tapped that oil in many ways first. Pennsylvania, for crying out loud. Southern California provided a lot of oil early in the 20th century to U.S. industrial development. But it quickly became apparent, and we'll talk about this soon, in the next couple of weeks, that that wasn't going to be enough, that our own oil supplies would not be sufficient to our needs, and that the oil we needed was, in fact, here in the Middle East. And there's a complex history of geopolitical maneuvering to ensure continuity of oil supplies. So I suggested that there might be social processes that you need to understand to explain the unevenness of development, that trade can redistribute resources and blur or rearrange the unevenness of nature, that people produce a built environment, such as roads and cities and energy networks, communication and transportation systems, and that these in many ways become more important than natural factors. And again, the railroad in late 19th century middle America is a great example of this. All of that corn, all those corn farms would not have come into being in the way they did in the absence of the railroad. Geographers sometimes call this built environment a second nature. It is produced in the sense that humans create it. It becomes a kind of second nature to us precisely because it's so, every day, it's so ubiquitous. It's so just there. We are so accustomed to it. And again, we can think of this at all the different scales, all the way from, the mattress you sleep in and what it's like, the house or apartment, the neighborhood. There's a complicated built environment that we all inhabit, and that built environment is easy to take for granted precisely because it's seemingly just there. We don't often think about what it took to produce it and how that's related to the production of other kinds of things. So urbanization, I think this is about as far as I got last time, is an example of this. You look around the world and you see a wide variety of degrees of urbanization. This is, again, done by country. So this is urban population as a percentage of the total population in 2003 in different countries. The dark red means that more than 70% of the population of that country lives in cities. That applies to pretty much the entire developed world, including the United States. What's the most urbanized state in America, in the United States? Do you know? What state has the highest percentage of its residents living in cities? California? Pardon? What was that guess? New York? No. Rhode Island? No. Illinois? No. Alaska? No. Wisconsin? No. I believe that in recent years it's gone back and forth between Nevada and Arizona. Not states that you think of as being particularly urban, right? But they are, in fact, the most urbanized in the sense that basically you just have to think about, what's the countryside look like? What do rural parts of Nevada and Arizona look like? Desert. Pretty sparsely populated. Doesn't leave a whole lot of the population in rural areas. You look at places in Africa. Here we have the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, for which there is no data. That's an interesting thing in and of itself. But most of Africa, you're looking at places below 20%, for example. Between 20 and 40% is most of sub-Saharan Africa. What about China? China has lots of big cities, India as well, but the countries as a whole are actually significantly less urbanized than the United States, which is, I think, noteworthy. It's just to say, again, you can have a huge population, but if it's distributed more or less evenly across the countryside, you will end up with a lot of people in rural areas, and therefore a lesser degree of urbanization. These circles represent urban agglomerations. The biggest purple one's more than 20 million people. Mexico City is not, in fact, located in the Pacific Ocean. But I think they put it there because otherwise it would have covered up a significant part of the country and not allowed them to display the other cities that are in the area. Again, you can look at, so India, which appears to be enormously urbanized, again, in fact, retains a large percentage of its population in the countryside. So here's an example at the global scale of the kind of built environment that we're talking about, just conceived of in terms of urbanization. But you have to think also about all the other systems that have to be in place for that to be possible, from water systems, electrical systems, trade networks for energy and other goods, the movement of food, that kind of thing. Any questions or thoughts? Population density. Interesting to try to map this or think about this map in connection with the one we just saw. So you see enormously high densities in India and China, even though, as shown in this map, the overall percentage of people in cities remains lower than in most of the rest of the world. So the highest density places, Europe and parts of Asia, and then just this pocket of New England. But in a lot of places, very, very sparse population on the interiors. Note the concentration of people along coastlines as well. All of this speaks to a built environment overlaid on top of or interacting with natural resource endowments and distributions to create this unevenness. So then finally, what if this unevenness, as suggested by Neil Smith, is endemic to capitalism? What if we need to understand capitalism to really understand and explain this unevenness? And the argument here runs more or less like this, that capital takes advantage of spatial differentiation. If you're an investor or looking to build a factory or some other undertaking, investment, you look for places where your costs are lower than normal for labor, land, or other inputs. You think about why Detroit emerged where Detroit did. Why building automobiles there made sense at the beginning of the 20th century. And you have to think about, well, where was the steel that you needed for those cars? Where were the factories that produced the rubber that you needed for those cars? Where were you going to be located such that you had access to a supply of labor? And you had access to markets that would allow you to get those automobiles to the places where you were going to sell them. Every investor, by this point in time, is well aware of the fact that there is an uneven landscape of costs and opportunities out there. When we watch the movie next week about the maquilas on the border with the U.S. and Mexico, it's very much, and actually the movie about Jamaica as well. The pursuit of cheap labor is a major motivating force in investment decisions. And those investment decisions are no longer necessarily limited by national boundaries. If you're thinking about making clothes, opening a textile factory, you don't need to just look inside your country. In fact, it might be incredibly logical for you to look outside your country because there will be a place somewhere out there where labor is very cheap, much cheaper than it is in other places, and that will attract your investment. Investments in technology and innovation create further unevenness in the built environment, places that are more advanced than others in various ways. So it becomes a reinforcing cycle. Capital looks for places where there are cheap inputs and opportunities, and it goes and it builds things. And I'm not talking just about factories. You can also think about the construction of roads, the construction of schools, the provision of certain kinds of training to educate laborers to do certain kinds of tasks. And those investments reinforce a certain unevenness and can create economies of scale and feedbacks that reinforce themselves. So Silicon Valley is perhaps the most conspicuous example around here these days, right? It's going around a handful of firms, but then the investments that are made and the people who are attracted there and the wealth that's created there have the effect of perpetuating and expanding investment in high tech. And it can alter, it can create San Jose and make it into the biggest single city in this region in a matter of decades. Geographers have called this, David Harvey in particular has called this the spatial fix. And I mentioned earlier in the last lecture that capital can alter space both by expanding outwards and by intensifying or remaking the built environments of its previous iterations and its current locations. It can differentiate internally as well as expanding outward. We suggested that imperialism and colonialism were first and foremost an example of conquest in search of cheaper inputs, investment opportunities, and new markets for goods. And when you read Bernstein and you think about capitalism and colonialism, that is, by this argument, an expression of the internal dynamics of capitalism at that point in time located principally in Europe, but expanding outwards and altering the economies, the societies, the built environments of the rest of the world. Internally, uneven development can proceed through investments in the built environment that absorb capital, just as investments overseas could absorb capital in the colonial period, and labor surpluses and create new environments for further growth. If you were looking for cheap land right now in the Bay Area, you would probably go to Richmond. And the land would be cheap there for reasons that have to do with what's happened there in the last 50 to 75 years. At one point, land was extremely scarce in Richmond because there was such an enormous need to build ships for World War II. It experienced this almost overnight explosion of development. And when the war ended, those jobs vanished. That land fell into relative sort of disuse, and that legacy persists to this day. Many of the houses that were built there during World War II were built so quickly and so cheaply that they were woefully inadequate housing stock. But what do you do afterwards? It takes even more money to tear them down and build nicer ones. And for a long period of time, right at the present, Richmond provides a sort of enclave of cheap land and cheap housing in the middle of this extremely wealthy metropolitan area. Other scholars have referred to this in connection with the Third World and colonialism as the development of underdevelopment. The argument here being that even as capitalism expands and remakes landscapes and economies, it reinforces poverty in some places just as it reinforces wealth and prosperity in other places. And the legacy of colonialism in the global south or the Third World is one of long-term resource depletion.